issues we're now facing, we feel that global warming, global heating, whatever title you prefer, is extremely important with the effects it has on us all. Think about the related issues of poverty, lack of food, and clean water affecting so many, and inadequate educational opportunities for our youth, and how we're all affected by global warming. Today, we'll be looking at current climate challenges, initiatives being provided by the UN and others, along with attempts for greater understanding in our schools. Of course, we're holding this webinar in the midst of the terrible tragedies being thrust upon the many brave people of Ukraine, but we do so in the hope that such efforts as ours will benefit all those striving for peace on this planet that we share. Today, you'll be meeting a few of the many CTAUN members who have been developing this webinar. I'm very proud of this great group. But two need to be recognized right up front. They are Ramu Damodaran, webinar moderator, and Eileen Venecia, webinar chair. We were so honored when Ramu announced when he was retiring from his position at the UN as the leader of the UN's Academic Impact Initiative with its focus on colleges and universities worldwide, that he wanted to be part of CTAUN. So we're thrilled with all his experiences and wit to have him as our moderator. Plus having Eileen Venecia, who is a CTAUN vice chair, along with her teaching and administrative experiences, made this a perfect setup, especially with her focus on working with youth. We do have about 275 registrants for today's webinar, with most coming from the US. But we do have 22 countries represented, quite an international group. So, for our opening video taking place at the United Nations in the General Assembly Hall, please pretend that you're there with us as this very special guest appears.
You okay? You need a minute? Cool. Okay. Listen up, people. I know a thing or two about extinction. And let me tell you, and you'd kind of think this would be obvious, going extinct is a bad thing. And driving yourselves extinct? In 70 million years, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. At least we had an asteroid. What's your excuse? You're headed for a climate disaster, and yet every year governments spend hundreds of billions of public funds on fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine if we had spent hundreds of billions per year subsidizing giant meteors. That's what you're doing right now. Think of all the other things you could do with that money. Around the world, people are living in poverty. Don't you think helping them would make more sense than, I don't know, paying for the demise of your entire species? Let me be real for a second. You've got a huge opportunity right now. As you rebuild your economies and bounce back from this pandemic, this is humanity's big chance. So here's my wild idea. Don't choose extinction. Save your species before it's too late. It's time for you humans to stop making excuses and start making changes. Thank you.
And that's our opening message to you. Franz Baumann is our keynote speaker. As an author and visiting research professor at NYU, focusing on international governance of climate change, along with being former UN Assistant Secretary General and Special Advisor on Environment and Peace Operations, he brings all that expertise and, I feel, brilliance to our webinar. Franz? You need to be unmuted.
Sorry. Okay, many thanks. It is a real honor and a joy to join you. Last time I did was in 2019 in the ECOSOC chamber at UN Secretariat. So now we do virtual, and that is why you get 22 countries to be part of this exercise. And I'm really pleased to talk to you about what I think is arguably, the most important subject for the future of human civilization, namely global heating. And if I say human civilization, I mean not nature, I don't mean the planet, because the planet is not in danger and nature will take care of itself. What I'm talking about is human civilization that is imperiled. And as you mentioned, Anne-Marie, with Russia's horrific war against Ukraine raging, this might not sound plausible that global heating is an even bigger threat, but it is simply because global heating can only be addressed and solved through cooperation of all countries around the world, especially the big ones. And Russia is a very big one. So the war worries me greatly, but the future of the UN, the fallout, worries me also. But back to the subject, global heating being the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. If you want to have it more technically, I think one could say that addressing global heating is an unprecedented global public policy responsibility, with emphasis firstly on unprecedented, secondly on global, thirdly on policy, and fourthly on responsibility. So the international community recognized this well over 30 years ago, namely in December 1988, if we could have the first slide, please, with the resolution of this one here. If you see, this is a resolution of the General Assembly 4353, protection of global climate for present and future generations of mankind. No gender sensitivity at the time, futures of mankind. This very resolution, and you see the link if you wanted to Google it and read it, it's only 2 pages or so, you will see that this resolution acknowledged the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the child of 2 UN institutions, namely UNEP in Nairobi and the World Meteorological Organization in Geneva. It won the Nobel Peace Prize, if you may remember, together with Al Gore in 2007. To be sure, this resolution was not an isolated gesture in the UN ivory tower. Get the next slide, please. Time magazine, 2 months later, proclaimed rather, Endangered Earth, the Planet of the Year. So 3 years later, United Nations organized the Rio Earth Summit, another wake-up call. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, you can take the slide down now, was signed, and US President George Bush announced the United States will continue to lead the world in taking economically sensible actions to reduce the threat of climate change. Does it sound familiar? This was over 30 years ago. Humanity since then has emitted more carbon dioxide than in all of its prior history. We can get the next slide, please. This is a very important slide, and you will, because, as has often been said, the climate change, global heating is a little bit, carbon dioxide emissions is a little bit like a, sorry, okay. It's a little bit like the image of a bathtub. You have water gushing in, but you have already 2/3 of the bathtub full. So we're not talking only about current emissions, we're talking about historical emissions. In economics, one calls this a flow issue and a stock issue. So the West grew rich by burning massive amounts of fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution. The resulting carbon dioxide emissions contribute to warming even today. From an equity point of view, this is fully justified that we are not looking only at what is happening today. You can see on the right that China is the largest emitter, but historically, it wasn't. Historically, the US contributed 29% to what is in the bathtub, European Union about 27, Russia 8, China 6, Japan 4, and India 2. As a group, developed countries contributed 76% and developing countries 24. We can move to the next slide, please. You can see here the carbon dioxide levels of the past 800,000 years. The dinosaur that we just saw reminds us that humans, Homo sapiens, has been around for about 300,000 years. I don't know whether we can make the slide a bit bigger, because then you could actually see that the level is 1950. So the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have always been around 280 parts per million, and they started shooting up after World War II. The slide is ending at about 419. It's a year old. I should update it because, and I Googled it, yesterday it was over 420. So we have moved from 280 to 420 in the space of a century. And given humanity's addiction to fossil fuels, scientists note that the goal of preventing temperature rises beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius has become ever more fanciful, and that condemns the world to deadlier heat waves, more destructive floods, more frequent wildfires, more cataclysmic weather, more conflict, and more forced migration. So if we take the slides off for a minute, we can remind ourselves that the detailed plans that governments have made to curb fossil fuel emissions and deforestation between now and 2030 puts the world on track to roughly 2.4 degree warming this century. And we are having these climate catastrophes already at 1.2. And so if we are warming and doubling, and that is what we are on track on, that is not good for human civilization. So now it remains to be seen if governments will actually follow through on what they have committed and what they have assured their citizens, but also the world at large. Let us jump to the slide after next, namely the warming between 1880 and 2021. You will see the inexorable, this one here, exactly. You will see the warming, and there is the first COP was actually in my capital, Berlin, in 1995, but how it has accelerated since then. The UN and the world scientists have actually achieved tremendously, and the next slide just shows us a little bit the Paris Agreement that was concluded in December 2015 that agreed to halt the warming at 1.5 degrees centigrade. The UN has created the IPCC, an unprecedented level, a group of scientists that do not do original research, but that actually monitor what the world's other active scientists are putting out. So let's take the slides down for a moment and just reflect on what has happened in the past half decade. Clearly, scientific models have become much more granular. They have become much more detailed, complex, and agreed by all the scientists. There is no disagreement among scientists. It was a couple of years ago among 5%, but now there is quite a common understanding in Russia, in China, in the US, in Europe, in Africa. So the scientific uncertainty is no longer an issue or lack of data. What has changed very much 4 years ago in 2018 was Greta Thunberg speaking very forcefully and creating a world youth environment movement. Probably we'll hear more about that. I am concerned that not that climate denialism has disappeared, that is great news, but that it has been replaced by climate delayalism. People are saying, yes, but we can't, it's too, and the windmills kill the birds. And so everybody has always an argument why we can't socially, social equity and so on. There is no consensus yet on the scale of the transformation required at the global level. So we are in a catch-22 situation, which means that the ecologically required is politically not feasible, and the politically feasible is ecologically insufficient. I think that going forward, countries will have to choose actively or by default between three options, or more precisely, a mix of three options. One is mitigation, namely to reduce the damage. Secondly is adaptation, which means learning to live with the damage, building a wall around southern Manhattan so that Wall Street will not be flooded, but New Jersey instead. That is adaptation. And the third element is suffering. If we do not mitigate, if we do not adapt, there will be suffering. So the wide open question is, what is the mix between the three elements, mitigation, adaptation, and suffering? The decisions not taken today means that those taken in the future will have to be taken under time pressure, in crisis conditions, possibly involving armed conflict. Today's casual procrastination, it has also been called a predatory delay, will strike future generations and even future governments as completely reckless. Educators have the obligation to alert students to the gravity of the problem, to the imperative of citizens to learn about the problem in all its minutiae, not to tire of the complexity, including the uncomfortable fact that there are no easy solutions. The involvement of all people, not so much as consumers. It is good to eat less meat, it's good to fly less, it has smaller car, all is fine. But the involvement of people as citizens of the world is what is needed to preserve a livable planet. I thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions. Thank you. Oh, and now it is my honor and pleasure, while I still have the floor, to introduce the moderator of the next segment, namely my friend Ramu Damodaran. Ramu recently, last year, retired from a distinguished career at the United Nations. We met 30 years ago in the Department of Peacekeeping, where we were colleagues and became friends. He made many marks in the United Nations. His last big assignment of the last decade or so was to be the founding director and leading spirit of the UN Academic Impact outreach to the world's higher educational institutions. But in his life before the UN, he was an accomplished diplomat of rank ambassador in his home country in India, where even before he worked as a journalist, TV anchor, radio producer, and whatnot. So I probably think that Ramu has a twin. He could not have possibly done all this himself, and there is somebody understudying him. And so, but now we see the real Ramu Damodaran, and please take the next segment forward. Floor is yours, Ramu.
Thank you so much, Franz. As you said, we are good friends, so I will forgive the generosity of your introduction, which I'm sure our audience will also. It's my privilege to lead on to the next segment, where I'm going to really follow up on the many points you've made, Franz, in a conversation with one of the most remarkable authors on the question of climate change, Katie Worth, whose book, Miseducation: How Climate Change is Taught in America, has implications, I would say, not just for this country where we are, but for the world at large. Because we talk so much about misinformation, but I think we are sometimes hesitant to talk about miseducation. And that brings in the point that you just made, Franz, about world citizens and how education is really global. It can also be national, it can also be local, but ultimately it has a purpose. And sometimes that purpose is not benign, it can be sinister. So let me ask Katie if you would join us to begin with. Your findings show that 1/3 of the people in the United States do not believe that climate change is man-made. How does that contribute, if you will, to your idea of the perils of miseducation?
Yeah, I mean, as Franz pointed out, there's been a long history of climate denialism, and now climate, I love his phrase, delayism, and that we're now at this kind of absurd point in that after, decades of this campaign where it's this phenomenon is already affecting all of our lives, our children's lives, and yet there's still people who are really entrenched in this belief and really deeply believe that the science is wrong on this issue, even as they're already explaining, they're already living through it. And, that denial campaign has has not only been focused on the adult world, it's also been focused on children. And so we know that there's 1 in 4 American kids rejected the idea of a climate crisis, of a human-made climate crisis, which is a lower percentage than their parents and grandparents who deny it even more, but it's still significant. And we know that the reason that that's the case is because there's been an intentional campaign about it. So I'm just going to use this prop here, for example. This is a book called Petro Pete's Big Bad Dream. And it's a kid's book made for kindergartners, first graders in Oklahoma. It's funded by the Oklahoma fossil fuel industry and has been distributed to schools all over Oklahoma and beyond. 98% of schools in Oklahoma have these products, not just this one, but a whole set of lesson plans from that group. And this book, in this book, Petro Pete wakes up one morning and realizes he's missing all of his petroleum products. And so he can't ride his bike to school. He can't bounce a ball at school, and so by the end of the day, he realizes that like, oh no, it's all just been a terrible nightmare. He was missing all of his petroleum products. And I bring this up because this is propaganda that is aimed at kids, that is explicitly telling them what a nightmare a world without petroleum products would be, without any hint at kind of the nightmare of a world that they may be walking into because of petroleum products. And, so this is not something that is on accident. It's not like an accident that people disbelieve in climate change or don't trust the science on climate change. Is very intentional. And it has a big impact. And the reason that these things exist is because the fossil fuel companies and their allies know that to influence what happens in the future on this issue, it's very effective to influence what kids today believe about it.
Thank you. That actually brings me to a question I have in a larger topographic perspective, if you will. A few days ago, Kurt Russell of the Oberlin School in high school in Ohio was named Teacher of the Year in the United States. And I read an interview with him where he said, I teach different courses. I don't teach controversial courses. And he mentioned specifically courses on women's rights, on LGBTQ rights. And I thought back of the earlier debates we've had in this country and in the world at large, say on courses on evolution or on the use of tobacco. There was a time when tobacco was seen as purely a commercial money-raising product rather than the health risk we have since discovered. So how would you see teaching climate change in that context of controversial versus different?
I mean, so the thing is that the science isn't controversial, as Franz laid out very clearly, right? So it's controversial in the adult political world, but that doesn't mean that it should be treated as such in the world of children when we're trying to give them the facts of the matter, right? And we know that it's very impactful to give kids this information. People, there's an argument like we owe children this information about the world that they have been born into, right? This century will be defined by this issue, and they deserve to have a little bit of basis of the science of it in their education at minimum. And but we also know it can have this big impact. So there's been some studies that show that like if you teach kids about this, there's an intergenerational impact. So their parents get more concerned about it and their grandparents get more concerned about it. And that is true, especially in conservative families. And especially between little girls and their fathers, interestingly. So it can have this effect even beyond just what you're teaching the kids. It can have an effect on communities and families. And we also know that teaching kids can actually be an important way to mitigate the crisis, because there was a really interesting study by Eugene Cordero of San Jose State University, where he followed a class of students. They were freshmen, I believe, and they'd gotten a really in-depth course on climate change as freshmen. And he followed them for years afterwards and tracked their consumer choices compared to another group of just regular students. And those students made considerably different consumer choices, to the effect that he calculated it out, extrapolated it, that if every student in America had this education, it would have enough, as big of an impact as putting a solar panel on every house in America. It was sizable, right? So we know that just telling people about this, telling kids about this, will impact how the crisis plays out.
When we had a practice session a couple of days ago, Katie, Connie Resnick of CTAUN had a lovely phrase about how the daffodils have withered in her garden, but the tulips are in bloom. So I wonder if I could adapt that and ask you, you've talked about the bad news, the withering. Is there good news? Are there tulips in bloom?
Yes, absolutely. We know there's lots of people working on this issue, and there is a really it's important not to just be doomeristic about this, because that's also not true, right? There is absolutely a chance to limit the suffering, as Franz said, that is caused by this. And there's a big difference between a 2-degree world and a 5-degree world, a huge difference, apocalyptic difference, right? And we still very much have the chance to keep it to 2 degrees if we want to, right? It'll require it's, you know, or 3 degrees. It would even be better than 5 degrees, right? So it's wrong to say that, like, well, it's too late, we haven't done enough, let's let it go. And so, you know, when people are taking action to do it. So like there's for example, in Washington, there's a really cool program that is giving every teacher an education about how to talk about climate change in their class. So every teacher is publicly funded, and that then has this ripple effect, right? And you know, like a lot of teachers, we already asked so much of teachers, and a lot of teachers didn't learn about climate change themselves. And so it's a really big ask to be like, oh yeah, and then teach your kids about climate change too. But they need resources. It's not that they're disinterested in it, they need resources. And there are efforts to give, California's doing it, Washington State is doing it, and they're scaling it up.
I'd like for a moment, if I may, Katie, to return to your earlier career, your beginnings of your career, if you will, in one of the loveliest parts of the world. Anne-Marie's husband, Don, who's an aviation enthusiast, and I have often wondered why more flights between the United States and Japan don't have a stopover in Guam. And I was reading an article in the Pacific Daily News where you began your career in Guam earlier this week, which talked about a lovely phrase, rain bonds. The fact that you have weather-related events which are not elevated to climate change, but which impact your life every morning when you get out for work or leisure, whatever. And that led me to think we may have a divide in the world between individuals and populations who live in areas where the weather and climate makes them vulnerable, and those who are blessed by not having such catastrophic events, or really postponing it to a future tense, as the dinosaur video showed so vividly. Do you feel that we have that danger of international fragmentation on this issue?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's like human nature, unfortunately, to not take action when something is invisible to you, when a problem is not maybe it's not even invisible to you, but it's not pressing right this moment. There's so many other problems that are very pressing right this moment. So even though we are a species that has foresight, we don't necessarily always act on it. And so the fact that these places that are far away, you know, from most of us are already seeing impacts, and honestly, even our own communities are seeing impacts, it's still something that is, it's sort of hard for people to prioritize. And that unfortunately is folly, right? And then I think the other thing that you sort of refer to there is like, you know, it's pretty easy to explain these things as like weather events, like, oh, of course, there's always been some, you know, bad weather, you know, there's always been tornadoes, there's always been fires, but we by ourselves don't, placed on our one place on the planet where we don't necessarily on our own have the capacity to see the trends. And if we can see the trends and talk to the kids about the trends, like then suddenly it does become more of a priority, because it's pretty scary once you start looking at it.
Thank you so much for that, Katie. And I think that very powerful metaphor about our being a species that has the capacity of foresight, but not necessarily the will to act upon it, really sums up so eloquently what you have argued for. And as you mentioned, what Franz talked about, the idea of delayism, it's going to be a difficult word to pronounce. And that brings me to the next segment in our program. And I'd like to really focus upon one particular individual who is going to be taught or not taught about climate change. She is 7 years old. Her name is Emma, and I'm privileged to welcome her grandmother, Donna Goodman, as our next speaker. Ms. Goodman is the author of Planet in Peril. She has worked with the UN with the Framework Convention on Climate Change, bringing young people to the table in an effort called YOUNGO, Y-O-U-N-G, NGO, and has also been responsible for innovative programs on climate education in places as diverse as the Amazon rainforest in Brazil and in Uganda, quite apart from this country itself. So may I hand it over to you, Donna?
Thank you so much, Ramu. And thank you so much to CTAUN for this opportunity, and kudos to all of our presenters and participants, attendees. Thank you. One of slightest correction, my granddaughter Emma is now 8 years old. So if she watches this, I want to correct that. She is the co-author with me in book 2 of the EcoMaster series, Ice and Fire, to add the young girl's perspective, because I guess I'm starting at the end. The reason I have switched to fiction and multimedia content development after a career of 30 years in UNICEF and the NGO I founded, Earthchild Institute, is because times are so critical now. And I believe that these children are born to take action, and they have the courage that maybe some in our generation and earlier generations didn't have to make these changes. And so my goal is to reach as many millions of the 2.2 billion people under the age of 18 right now as possible. So the EcoMasters Ice and Fire book 2 is directly addressing climate change. The series is girl-led, global, and water-powered. So it brings together girls who are taking action from the United States, Malawi, Laos, India, and into a hidden indigenous training center in the Amazon in Brazil. And in book 2, they're dealing with the melting of the Himalayan glaciers into the Ganges. So a little bit about that. And I'm going to go back now a little bit to earlier in my career when I was working for UNICEF in 2006, building on the timeline that Franz has put out for us. In 2006, I attended the first COP of the climate change in Bali on behalf of UNICEF. And at that time, and heard Al Gore speak just before the Nobel Peace Prize, but at that time, there was no constituency in the Framework Convention on Climate Change for children or young people. There was no platform for children or young people to speak. And we were able to initiate that action through UNICEF and NGO, Earthchild Institute, and colleagues at the UNFCCC, and several countries came together, and the world ratified the Children and Youth Constituency, which now has equal weight to businesses and research institutions and so forth. And that is the YOUNGO, the youth NGOs, children and youth constituency to the UNFCCC. So it's something that I'm really proud about, because as Franz mentioned, Greta Thunberg, a lot of people mention her to me like, wow, now kids are getting involved because of Greta. But frankly, I mean, I think it's just awesome and amazing what she's doing, but I've been working with kids since 2003 that are taking actions and doing these things, maybe not getting as much of a global stage to do it on. And so a little different from the textbooks and policy side, is why I got into the local action for climate change. Mostly because most of my work has been in the developing world. I've worked in more than 60 countries with children and young people. But the whole idea of adaptation and empowerment for global action and education started in northern Kenya in a place called West Pokot, and this school that I visited, which had like everything wonderful for the environment. They had a vegetable garden, they had flowers that they sold at the market, they had one tree per child that each child was taken care of. And then after visiting all of these wonderful things that they were doing, was a very, economically disadvantaged school. They didn't have textbooks, but they had what they called talking walls. So on the wall, they have images and they have pointers, and they talk about, in this particular case, it was the life cycle of a plant. And what happened was they talked about photosynthesis, they talked about how the plant evolves and grows. And I asked the presenters, what does this have to do with what's going on in your garden? And nobody knew. And so then I went on a quest really to find out. I asked my kids' friends back here in Connecticut. I asked in every country, every place I went to, I asked kids, what does this have to do with your life? Like, what do these trees have to do with you anyway? Like, why do you need the tree here? What about the water? Is it clean to drink and so forth? And I found out that nobody knew. And that's a little bit different than facts and knowledge and textbooks, because it is the way we live as a civilization and interact with nature. And so that's really the background of what I've done in my professional life. And we've seen so many of these kids from the 2003 World Water Forum in Mexico City, where kids came in front of ministers and they said, we're ready to work with you. Are you ready to work with us? And all the adults got up and they said, yes, we are. But to this day, now almost 20 years later, there is not even 0.1% of climate change adaptation money that goes into the education sector or goes into the local actions of children. And so this is really what I have been focusing on and working on: real life training. Even in the EcoMasters, they have to get to this training center in the Amazon. And the goal for the whole franchise is to have training centers on each continent where teachers can go and learn. For instance, if you're teaching about solar energy, can kids actually put together a solar panel? And do you have the solar panels on that school? So we understand more than pedagogy, whether oil companies are advocating this or we're telling them that this is happening and you have to make informed choices, but also like, what does it have to do with me? What does it have to do with my life? And I find that these kids are so highly evolved. It just takes a little like, hey, did you remember this is connected to your garden or to the water? And they take it from there. And when you ask them what is their biggest thing that holds them back, they always say, almost always, 99% in wealthier countries, less developed countries, they say our challenge is getting adults to take us seriously. And so as an adult myself, I also have doubts about the retraining of those of us that have a lifetime of behaviors. So much of it is behaviors. And I entered this whole climate change area through water. I started in water and sanitation and UNICEF. And so the reason why we ended up at the COP in Bali in 2006 is because water tables, even then, were we're lowering. And they have been talking for years now about the next wars being over water. And the conflicts in many places are over water. They used to be over oil and other resources. More and more, it has to do with water. And I find with kids, especially those who have already experienced a natural disaster, just the simple skills of knowing how to prepare water for fresh drinking, for clean drinking, safe drinking, what to eat in the forest, what to plant, and what's safe to eat, how to survive in nature. I know these are forms of adaptation, but I think the other side of suffering is empowerment. And so this is my message for today: empowerment, and to do what you can in your schools, in your environment, whether it's planting trees or bushes or learning how to take care of the water, as well as advocating. And the characters in the EcoMasters are all based on kids that I have met and worked with all over the world who have led these incredible projects. So that's really what I wanted to share with you today. Did I go over my time, Ramu?
No, thank you so much, Donna. And that was so compelling. And I'm just thinking of that figure again, 1/10 of 1% or less than 1/10 of 1%. And how much of money is either not going into education or is being misdirected to borrow Katie's phrase again, misdirected to miseducation. So thank you for that perspective. And thank you for bridging generations, working with all the young minds you are, including, of course, Emma. Thank you, Emma. And I'd like to enlarge this discussion to go back to the point you mentioned, Donna, about what does it have to do with me, and bring in 4 young minds who will reflect upon that, led by Kiana Yabut, who is a student at the University of Guam and will lead the discussion, which will include Gianna Barcia of Binghamton University here in the United States, who's been associated with CTAUN for the past couple of years. Peter Brosnan, who is the director at large with CTAUN and was a graduate of Manhattanville College here in New York, along with Sean O'Hagan from the Oceanside Middle School, who's also, among other accomplishments, a black belt in karate. So we've got a formidable group to join us, and I'll ask Kiana to lead it on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Kiana Yabut. I'm a representative in the Guam Youth Congress, and it's essentially a lawmaking body that's composed of Guam's youth from the ages of 15 to 23. Basically, what we do as representatives is we do everything that our local senators do. So we go into session, we write bills, we pass bills, and when those bills pass our body, they actually go into the Guam government, where they go through the government process and could possibly become law. So recently I've introduced a bill that would ban the use of styrofoam takeout containers in restaurants, and another bill I co-sponsored that sought to give out free period products to all students in public schools. And that is now actually a law in Guam. And so one of the main things we really talk about in the Guam Youth Congress is climate change, right? My bill to ban styrofoam passed unanimously within the body. And recently in February, we had another resolution that spoke out against the development of a water park resort along one of Guam's most important coastlines. And that also passed unanimously. And so what we're seeing from this is that it's a very important issue amongst the youth. And it's something that we feel very passionate about. And for good reason, right? In Guam and all around the world, climate change affects all aspects of life. And I always like to say that climate change isn't just an environmental issue, it's an everything issue. For Guam specifically, climate change becomes a safety issue when we realize that it's changing our weather patterns, which means stronger and longer typhoons for us as temperatures rise. In Guam, it becomes a health issue when we realize that Guam has one of the highest car-to-person ratios, and our air is being constantly polluted with burning fossil fuels. And it's also becoming an economic issue because climate change is damaging our coral reefs, making beaches and other parks progressively unsafer for our locals and tourists. And for an island whose #1 industry is tourism, this poses a really big problem. But climate change, I think, is a very sneaky thing. And I think we've heard this multiple times tonight. Because we don't see it immediately affecting our lives, people have a tendency to place the issue of climate change kind of on the back burner, policymakers included. And as years go by and that back burner kind of continues to sizzle, one day that climate change pot is going to overflow. And by the time that pot overflows and we realize it, it's already going to be too late and too much damage will have already been done. And so what the youth in Guam are doing now is trying to prevent that spill. You know, we've taken it upon ourselves to write legislation against climate change, to advocate for greener policies, and we're bringing these issues to the forefront where we believe they belong. And I think why we feel so passionately about climate change is because as young people, we are constantly thinking about our future. You know, for someone in high school, it's where am I going to go to college? Am I going to go to college? What would I major in? And for someone like me who's about to graduate college is where am I going to go to grad school? Or am I going to go to law school? What do I want to do as a lifelong career? And the more you try to create this bright future for yourself, you come to realize that there is no bright future in an Earth that is affected severely by climate change. And so what we're doing now by advocating for things like greener policies, writing legislation against climate change, is we're kind of ensuring that bright future, right, for ourselves, for our children, and for the future generations to come. And so I'm really glad to be here and lead the youth discussion. And I believe now the rest of the youth panel is going to join me.
Thank you so much, Kiana. I mean, you just offered some great insight about the severity of climate change and the impact of it in our futures. I would like to now invite Donna and Franz to engage in a brief discussion with the youth panel.
Sure.
So do you want me to take the lead, or are you waiting for questions, or you ask questions, or you want answers? I don't have answers.
Oh, sure. I can ask you the first question, actually, Franz. So one of the questions we have is, what are some best practices for individuals to undertake to help mitigate and adapt to the adverse effects of climate change?
Gianna, this very much depends where you are. If you are in Guam, or if you are in Ghana, or if you are in the Alps, or in Westchester County, it is always very different. So in some places you are running out of water, the earth is parched. In other areas, the trees are dying because the roots no longer get water and there are bugs. So adaptation is very much a local thing. What I find disturbing is that those who have contributed the least to the issue of, by the way, I speak deliberately not about climate change, because educators will know this. Many people say, oh, the climate has always changed. That is true, but never so fast as in the last 50 years. And what we're talking about, to use proper language, I think, is global heating. That is the change that The Guardian, for example, has used in editorial policy. So those who have contributed the least to global heating, mainly in Africa, are suffering the most. Whereas those, or their grandparents or their parents, or us, all of us living lives with cars and airplanes and good food and strawberries in December and avocados 12 months. So we are, through our lifestyle, causing a lot of that. And so, Kiana, the adaptation, I mean, this is a whole world, and the former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has spent now his post-Secretary General time working on adaptation to help countries in their own way. Mozambique, even north and south, is different to come to grips. Not to say that we should not do mitigation, but adaptation. You know, there is a scientist, a British scientist, Sir Nicholas Stern, who wrote one of the first climate reports in 2007. And what he said, so adaptation is managing the unavoidable. Whereas mitigation, I said earlier, it was reducing the damage, but mitigation is actually avoiding the unmanageable. Avoiding the unmanageable, that is mitigation. We have to reduce carbon emission, and adaptation is managing the unavoidable. And that's what we have to do for those who come after us, especially your children.
Thank you, Franz. So my question is for Donna. How will climate change affect the lives of today's children tomorrow?
Well, thank you for the question, Gianna. And it's so great to learn about what all of you are doing. The Guam Youth Congress. I'm living here in Florida, and styrofoam is everywhere. So big kudos for that work. What kids can do is so much. They can be aware of their local environments, and it is adaptation, and it is also mitigation in many ways. I think, you know, it goes back to, like, even when I was growing up, my brother got my grandmother to stop smoking, you know, because of the messages they were getting. And it has to do with a little bit what Katie was saying as well, messages that they get in school. But even if they're not getting it in school, that they, my granddaughter Emma that was mentioned is in a ninja warrior class. And they already at age 7, 8 are doing zip lining and climbing walls, and really, you know, survival skills that we will all need. I mean, the fact of the matter is that climate change is already happening. So the mitigation at the level of, like, young children is, you know, is really comes around in their influence of their parents' buying behaviors and so forth. But for them, I believe that the survival skills, and especially, you know, taking care of the water and trees, and understanding, you know, that the trees are holding the ground. You know, I've been in places that have had disasters. I mean, when I worked in UNICEF, the Hurricane Katrina happened, and there were so many people there, and that's in the United States, in New Orleans, and they died because they didn't know what to do with their feces, like, and they didn't have water to drink. So, you know, these skills, I think, and as I said, I think that you all and those younger than you are very courageous and brave-hearted people that have come in for this time. So that's my thought about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thank you as well for your thoughts. I actually have a question to both you and Franz. So whoever wants to get ahead of it first. My question is, how are people adapting to the effects of climate change? And what are the known limits to adaptation? And will those known limits change as well?
Franz? Should I? Okay. I mean, known limits, we just don't know, you know, nothing like this. We started with the dinosaur. You know, that's as close as we can get to knowing really what is going to, or what could happen, or what will eventually not happen, hopefully. So I think that adaptation, you know, is education, whether you're talking about adults or children in developing country or wealthy countries. you know, I think learning to live in harmony with nature, and which is why I emphasize the training and applied knowledge, like the solar panels on the school and understanding how solar panels work, and, you know, composting and understanding like the process of science of composting. This is the way I look at the education, and the more it becomes second nature to young people knowing how to do these things, you know, the better their lives will be moving forward.
If I may just add to what Donna said, and to recall what Katie said, it's a very important point, namely, a world of 2 degrees is much better than a world of 3 degrees. A world of 2 degrees will be catastrophic, but much better than a world of 3 degrees. So the adaptation will depend on where we are going. Currently, the world is on track to warm to about 3 degrees by the end of the century. It's catastrophic. It is clearly less catastrophic in Austria than in Bangladesh, because Bangladesh will be flooded. People have nowhere to go. And you see refugees from Ukraine, they want to go home. And they will go home once the fighting stops. People from Bangladesh displaced by water cannot go home. There will not be a home anymore. And they will not be welcomed where they go in India or elsewhere. That is, and talking about limits of adaptation. So we are looking indeed, also in terms of hunger and water and heat. In parts of Southeast Asia, it will be so hot that people cannot be outside anymore. So we cannot look at it from the point of view of us in the developed North living with air conditioning. We crank it up. And Donna, yeah, with your thing with the, yeah, we put solar panels. We, because we are rich, have all manner of ways of adapting. But the world in which we will live, where there are people who do not have the means, that is something we have to prevent through action, through more thinking, through more mitigation, because we are hurtling into a catastrophe. It's happening. Donna said we are in the middle of it. And so I'm often asked, what, is it not depressing? Yes, it's terribly depressing. But I think that it might be brutal, but no hope is actually better than false hope, because it means that you guys know it is serious and you'll do something about it across the board. This is the most, you know, it is like cancer. You might still feel very good, but if you don't act against it, it will only get worse. So that's why I'm so grateful for this discussion, this event. And this is, I think, with no disrespect, Donna, what Greta Thunberg has done since 2018 is moving this to the center of the world's attention. In science, this has been known for, and I mentioned it for 30 years. But you know, if you know it in niches, it's not human knowledge. It is human knowledge when people talk at dinner table and talk to Uncle Joe, who is in denial. And then they throw the spaghetti at him. That's when we get so.
Thank you. I appreciate the responses.
My question is for Franz. What are the effects that climate change has on our health and well-being?
Well, the first thing is, of course, COVID. Climate change and the way we are interacting with nature brings about zoonotic diseases. COVID is the latest one, SARS, Ebola. So we are encroaching on nature and animals, and they are fighting back, and we are getting the disease. So this COVID thing will be over because of vaccines, but the next one will happen in a year or two. There is absolutely no doubt So to think that once we've gone through the COVID thing, we have dealt with pandemics, absolutely not. And so as long as we have agriculture with pigs and animals in mechanized in these big ghettos, as long as you have chicken that costs $3, you will have infection, you will have zoonotic diseases. So it is up to us, you know, if things are cheap, there is usually a price. This great American ecologist, one of the first one, who was very much behind Earth Day in 1970, said there is no free lunch.
Yeah.
And so if you think it is, the price will have to be paid, and it will be paid down the road. Other thing, it's the 4 laws of ecology. Everything is connected to everything else. And that, Sean, is very much also in response to your question. So you can get a temporary reprieve, but no free lunch, no getting out of it.
Thank you so much. I guess I'll ask my next question to Donna. You kind of touched upon it, that how the youth is empowered. So I'm gonna change my original question up a little bit. How do we empower the adults to get involved locally or internationally?
I think that's really a great question, Sean. And I completely agree with Franz in that everything is connected to everything else. And Greta has been a great speaker for the cause. My only point is that there are so many more kids that don't get that spotlight. But back to the question, what can we do to influence adults? One of the things that has been like a cornerstone of my career has been trying to get adults to see the value of what kids are doing and the value of education. And, you know, something Katie said, I mean, we're about the next generation, what they're learning today, that the oil companies understand this. I mean, it's unfortunate that only, you know, that the oil companies are investing in this kind of education and others are not. You know, I wish that there was a pot of money to make books like that in, you know, states and countries everywhere, and to get adults to, you know, I worked in Nepal for a few months on this climate issue, and there were like many millions of dollars coming in, and it goes into, for example, it goes into the finance ministry, and then it goes to an environment and sometimes water. But the education ministry is never even at the table. They're never even, you know, they don't even get that that's part of what they need to do. So I think that the more that we can raise the awareness with adults that children and youth can and do make a difference, some of the case studies of what you guys are doing, what others are doing, I think, you know, that is really the way. And to hold them accountable to their promises. Like I said, in 2006, we had a room with 40 ministers stood up and said, yes, we want to work with you. But, you know, 6 years later, we wouldn't do it again because none of them had taken action. So it's very easy for adults to forget those promises, and holding their feet to the fire a little bit is important.
Actually, I'll jump in on the tail end of that question, and I'll say, how do we support the people who do listen? How do we support the people who are asking the questions? As Franz mentioned, even if there's no hope, still push forward. How do we convince people to keep going? And what steps do you envision are needed for other people to help those people push forward?
If I can, a great question, Peter. And that's why I'm teaching and I'm working with graduate students, and getting knowledge is power. And that's why I'm so happy to talk to people who are educators. Like CTAUN. So people feel empowered if they understand the issue, if they understand the science, the history, the background, because, you know, knowledge gets you out of helplessness. And whether you then work on, like my graduate students, on things like rare earths and writing papers about how to get it out of our, so one has to encourage people to understand as much as possible, to understand the complexity, and then to speak to others. Maybe you inspire the next guy who wins the physics Nobel Prize and who solves the world's energy problem. So if you are not the scientist, your specialization is to pull things together, not in a dramatizing way saying the world is going under, but in understanding and bringing forward to others what this actually means. So if I may, I mentioned the 4 laws of ecology, but what I didn't mention, because I wanted to make this a puzzle, but we're running out of time, is the name is Barry Commoner. Barry Commoner, who died a few years ago, he wrote this book in 1971, so that's 50 years ago, which is called The Closing Circle. And in that, the 4 laws is that everything is connected to everything else. So there is no ecosphere for humans, but there is an ecosphere for all living organism, and what affects one affects all. Sean, your question about zoonotic diseases. The second one is that everything must go somewhere. There is no waste in nature, and there is no a way to which things can be put. And the third one is nature knows best, which means any major human-made change is likely to deteriorate the system, not improve it. And the fourth one is there is no such thing as a free lunch. Exploitation of nature will inevitably involve the conversion of resources from something useful to something useless. So I found myself, Peter, to your question, Barry Commoner and his thinking, liberating, empowering, and that's why I'm speaking to you.
It's wonderful.
I'd like to thank all of you for having
I
sorry, I beg your pardon, Donna, please.
Franz just said, in the interest of time.
No, please go ahead.
Second that. Yeah. Everything is connected to everything else. And the pandemics, we've been seeing it for years. Like, for instance, Brazil was a country where dengue fever was eradicated. And then, you know, not too many years ago, it came back. I mean, because the mosquitoes are breeding. And again, to me, that goes back to behaviors like of stagnant water. But we're always, you know, fighting against disinformation. And, you know, that's why I think absolutely knowledge is power, and understanding how things work in this world is essential to all of us.
Thank you for that, and for that thought about everything being connected to everything else, because that brings us to the first of the questions that we've received. And I'd like to bring Katie into this, if I may, and ask her if she could respond. This is a question from Shane Simmons about the circular economy. Is that something which people can be educated upon and really create a world which is sustainable in a give and take sense?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that, because I don't focus on economics. But what I would say is, just as I've been listening to your questions and your answers, you know, I think that it's important. You know, I think it's just very important to focus on political action, and that is what is going to change this. And, you know, like, if anything will, and getting, the thing about young people is that they have this moral authority in this issue, because young people are the ones that are going to be really impacted the most, more than any of the rest of us, right? And so using that to your advantage, manipulating the adults into feeling guilty, I think that's what Greta and so many other of the activists are so good at and so powerful at, is just truly bringing the sense of shame on the older generations that we deserve, right? And that will hopefully then create action. And the question, I think that there is a lot to be done on a global scale, and there's a lot of ways to approach this economically. But I also think local political action is really important too. So I'm going to give you one example that I've been reporting on for a story for Scientific American this last few months. But last year, the Texas State Board of Education adopted new standards, academic standards for what's going to be taught in classes, in science classes in that state, right? And those standards are really powerful. It sounds like a little bit arcane. It is arcane. It's like educational bureaucracy, but it winds up influencing what's in textbooks, because Texas is one of the biggest textbook purchaser in America, in the nation. And so the textbook companies pay attention to what's happening in the Texas standards and then create this product that then is sold all over the country, right? And so the Texas State Board of Education was thinking about science, and for the first time, they were considering putting climate change into the Texas science standards. Well, who showed up at those meetings? The Texas Energy Council did, which is an organization that is, it's like an industry organization made up of other industry organizations, all of which are petroleum companies and their byproducts, right? And they showed up to every single meeting, and they pushed and they pushed and they pushed for specific language to be put in and taken out. And they single-handedly watered down the climate change language in the Texas state standards in a way that will impact education all over the country, right? And there was never more than a couple dozen people in that room, right? So it's like, had there been a little bit more organizing, had there been a little bit more public pressure, had students shown up and said, this is wrong, which it is, it's wrong, and you shouldn't have a vested interest deciding what kids learn, right? Then maybe the Texas State Board of Education would not have, at least not with as much impunity as they did, just done the bidding of the Texas oil industry, right? So is that kind of thing, like paying attention to local politics can really wind up having these other impacts, right? And so it's just really beautiful to hear what Kiana is doing in Guam. And I just think that that's the powerful thing to do, is getting involved in the local politics more than eating vegan or, whatever individual actions that we all take that are also meaningful to us and meaningful to the planet. But ultimately the political action is what is going to change the game. I don't think that was actually answering that question, but it was sort of on my mind after listening to all of your questions and answers.
No, it served it very well. Thank you, Katie, and thank you for that segue, if you will, into political action, because that really brings my next question to Franz about the possibilities of political action in one very specific sphere, which I'm sure he'll enlighten us on: energy transition metals. Now, this is something which I think has been particularly imperiled by what is going on in Ukraine at the moment. But beyond that, could you tell us something about this, Franz, and how vital it is for perhaps concerted political action, possibly under the auspices of the UN, on an issue like this?
Well, the science tells us that the power of the sun that hits the earth every hour is about several hundred times the energy requirement of what we have. So it is not that we need, coal, oil, and gas is actually stored solar energy. It is plant matter that has been there millions of years ago, and now we're digging it up and burning it. So instead of using dead solar energy, we will in the future use live one directly. As Katie so clearly says, you have vested interests that want to sell gas today because that's what they invested their money in. And so they are not so keen in a different way, even though it is cleaner, the air is cleaner, people will not die so much of lung cancer. It is also much cheaper because the sun is free. So you don't have the infrastructure of the oil rigs out of in the Gulf of Mexico, and you have the refineries, and you have the trucks, and you have the gas stations. All of that you can save because the sun delivers it for free. So there is no question that we will move to renewable energy because now already it is the cheapest way of generating energy. The question is not whether, but how fast. And hopefully around the world, especially in countries in Africa or India too, where you don't want big supply infrastructure, where you empower villages. And that's why the sustainability goals are so important. Clean energy to rural areas where people right now do not have fridges for water or ceiling fans or lights to study at night. A bit of energy that can come from the roof is so liberating. So we will get there in the next decade. The economics are falling into place. I have absolutely no doubt. Fossil fuel, Katie, sorry to tell you, fossil fuel is dead. They don't know it yet, but it will. They are going under in the next 20 years. And just as I predict that in 20 years, people will not eat meat anymore and will look in horror as we look back at slavery, how could we have ever killed animal for food? We will look back at how on earth could we dig up coal and oil and stink up the world and burn it instead of leaving it in the ground and working with wind and the sun, be healthier and cleaner and cheaper. And Katie, I find it so impressive what you're saying and so true. The oil industry is very powerful because the interests are very concentrated. And with renewables, when everybody generates their own energy from the roof or from their garden or villages or communities, you don't have that big power anymore. So it's actually also democratic. So that's why we are moving, Ramu. Some people will still resist it and will fight, but their fight is actually lost. And especially if there are people like you who are carrying the fight forward, it will be faster, but the battle is won already.
Thank you for that upbeat note, Franz. And I really look forward to your book on climate change being titled Roses in December, but sustainable roses, not just roses which have been rehydrated. Thank you for that. And let me get to our last question to Donna. Franz, you mentioned India, and I recall we're in the 50th anniversary year of the first conference on environment, the Stockholm Conference in 1972, where the Indian Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, famously said, poverty is the greatest polluter. And we have a question from Kevin Corley, who's asked about justice. How do we reconcile justice for the earth with justice for the poor? Donna, could I have your reflections on that?
Thank you for such a profound question, Ramu. And intergenerational justice, environmental justice, these are things that are human rights. In the Convention on the Rights of Children, children have a right to healthy, safe environments. In the human rights and even the Women's Convention, these things are rights. So to me, the question is like, how do we get people to understand these rights? Now, for instance, the Convention on the Rights of the Child has been ratified by every country on earth except the United States and Somalia. So it's an incredible conundrum, really. Like I just can't understand how rights and justice cannot be part of the conversation all the time. Like I said, I live here in Florida, and just yesterday, you know, they struck down, I think it's the second biggest textbook, as Katie was talking about Texas, and it's not climate change, but they just struck down all of the mathematics textbooks yesterday because of social justice issues that were in the textbooks. So really, you know, getting people to understand their rights, that rights are a real thing, human rights, children's rights, women's rights. I think it can, you know, really help. The greatest, you know, you mentioned the Rio agenda. I mean, Article 21 was, everything was in there. The education, the empowerment, the renewable energy, Agenda 21, excuse me. It was all there, but nobody knows about it. It's the best kept secret in the world. No, there was never any political action behind it. There was never any communication or focused communication. And I think that that's the most important thing, because the rights are there, agreed by most governments. And, you know, it's a very well kept secret.
Thank you so much for that, Donna, and thank you for our wonderful panelists. But I'll let our leader, Anne-Marie, do a formal thanks to all of you and to end this program. Over to you, Anne-Marie.
Thanks to all of our speakers today. They have been very much enlightening, and they've shared so many good suggestions that we need to follow. Thanks to our webinar leaders, Ramu Damodaran and Eileen Venecia, and to Eileen's Committee of Research Specialists. Thanks to our CTAUN technical experts, Elizabeth Schumann, Executive Director, Connie Rensink, Vice Chair, and Peter Brosnan, Director at Large. Thanks to all our participants. A recording of this webinar will be on our website, as well as links to important UN events, plus all attendees will receive a survey shortly. Check out and spend some time on the UN website, UN.org, for its extensive coverage on news, history, and its many programs, along with available tours, guides, and educational resources. And of course, stay tuned to the CTAUN website, teachun.org, for announcements of upcoming programs, awards, etc. We are in the midst of exploring future possibilities, and we're so thrilled with all of you being with us today and looking forward to having more such get-togethers. Thank you again.